What Trump has done in the last 48 hours is to try to turn the war in Ukraine into an advent calendar, each day a little more pressure, and by Christmas a signed surrender. The so-called timetable he is imposing on Zelensky is not about peace by Christmas, it's about forcing Ukraine to choose at speed between unacceptable territorial concessions and the risk of losing its principal ally. First, the mechanics of the deadline. We know that Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff spent hours with Putin in Moscow, then 3 days in Miami with Zelensky's negotiators before holding a 2-hour call with Zelensky himself. Out of that process came the revised US plan, trimmed from 28 to 20 points after some obvious anti-Ukrainian points were removed, but still premised on Ukraine giving up territory in the Donbass in exchange for vague security guarantees. According to multiple briefings to European leaders, Witkoff and Kushner told Zelensky he had only days to respond. One official summarized Washington's message starkly. Trump wants this wrapped up by Christmas. The Telegraph then sharpened the line further. Trump has warned Zelensky that he has until Christmas to accept the deal, arguing that Russia has the upper hand and that, in the end, size will win. Notice how time is being weaponized. Trump is not saying, let us negotiate until we reach a just settlement. He is saying, in effect, you are losing, you are smaller, therefore you must sign quickly on my terms. The deadline is both a cudgel and an alibi. If there is no deal by Christmas, Trump can turn to his domestic audience and say, I tried, I blame Zelensky and the Europeans. Second, look at how Zelensky has responded. He's not meekly accepted the US timetable. He's tried to surround it with other clocks. In London, at number 10, he met Starmer, Merz and Macron, the so-called E3, who all described this as a critical moment and reaffirmed that Europe still wants a just and lasting peace with robust security guarantees for Ukraine. Zelensky then flew on to Brussels and Rome and to the Vatican, in effect building a European counter-timetable, European and Ukrainian components of a peace plan first, American component second, blessed by God. He's then moved on to Trump's attack line about democracy. Trump has been parroting the Kremlin talking point that Ukraine has ceased to be a democracy because elections are postponed under martial law, and he has demanded a wartime vote as a test of legitimacy. Zelensky's reply is almost brutally practical. If the US and Europe will provide the security guarantees, he's ready to hold elections within 60 to 90 days. That is another timetable, not imposed from Washington, but conditional on Western help and Ukrainian law. Third, look at what is actually inside the supposed deal by Christmas. Ukraine is being asked to withdraw from parts of Donetsk and Luhansk and to accept that Russia keeps most of its recent gains, while in return it receives unspecified security guarantees from the US and a looser framework of promises from Europe. Kyiv is pushing for something that looks like NATO's Article 5, written into a treaty that can be ratified by the US Senate and cannot simply be torn up by the next president. It is also asking Europe for long-term commitments to arm Ukraine, finance its defense industry, police its skies and seas through the so-called coalition of the willing. In other words, Ukraine is being told to make irreversible concessions on territory within a matter of days in exchange for guarantees that are still at best half-hearted sentences. The Ukrainian side speaks of being caught between the demands on territory that they can't accept, and a Russian side and a US side they can't reject. That is precisely why Zelensky has rushed to anchor himself in European capitals. If he signs too quickly on Washington's timetable, he risks breaking the unity that has kept Ukraine alive since 2022. If he refuses, he risks being painted as the man who rejected peace. Now, set Trump's Christmas clock against two other clocks, the military clock and the European clock, and on the battlefield, the war is grinding into its fourth year. Russia is pushing hard around Pokrovsk and Mirnohard, and Ukraine insists the battle is not over, even as Moscow claims victory. Mirnohard and Pokrovsk are still in question. Russia has more men, more shells, and a leadership willing to expend both in grotesque quantities. Trump seizes on this to repeat the simple arithmetic of size. Russia is bigger, therefore Ukraine must yield. But that argument is politically convenient as much as it is analytically shallow. We have ample historical evidence that a larger empire can lose wars of choice against smaller, more motivated opponents, especially when those opponents are sustained over time by a wider coalition. For Europe, meanwhile, this is not just about saving Ukraine in time for Christmas. It's about the shape of the post-war order for decades. The Norwegian Foreign Minister, Espen Barth Ida, puts it very neatly. A cheap ceasefire in which Ukraine is forced to surrender land would create a very expensive peace for the whole continent. In plain terms, a rushed, unjust settlement now would lock in instability, invite future aggression, and normalise the use of invasion as a bargaining chip. The timetable that matters to Oslo, to London, Warsaw, Vilnius is not Washington's calendar up to 25th of December. It is the next 25 years of European security. Trump's rhetoric about Europe is not incidental to this timetable. It is integral to it. In his Politico interview, he describes Europe as weak, decaying, hollowed out by migration and political correctness. He singles out London and Sadiq Khan in particular in language that is both insulting and telling. And he hints that the US might walk away from European allies whose ideology doesn't align with his own. The subtext is clear. If Europe doesn't stop sabotaging his peace, he will blame it for prolonging the war and question whether it is still a reliable partner. So, the Christmas deadline functions on three levels at once. It is an attempt to break European resistance by forcing a decision at speed. It is a way to discipline Europe by casting its insistence on a just peace as the petulance of a weak, decadent elite. And it is a domestic political tool that allows Trump to say to his base, "I offered peace, they chose war." Against that, Starmer, Zelensky, Merz, Macron and others are trying to construct a different temporal logic. Yes, this is a critical moment, and yes, the military situation is grave, but the answer is not to stampede Ukraine into an Advent capitulation. It is to harden support now on weapons, on sanctions, on frozen Russian assets, so that any eventual negotiation is conducted from something closer to parity and with genuine enforceable guarantees. If you strip away the noise, that is the clash of timetables. Trump wants a deal that he can brand as peace by Christmas, even if it entrenches Russian gains and leaves Ukraine's future hanging on the mood of the US electorate. Ukraine and its European partners are arguing that the only peace worth having is one that might take longer than Christmas, but doesn't make the whole of Europe pay a far higher price in the years to come. So when we talk about the timetable Trump is reimposing on Zelensky, we are really talking about whose clock governs the war, the clock of a US president hungry for a quick win, or the slower, more uncomfortable clock of law, security, and Ukrainian survival. The tragedy is that time is genuinely short on the front line, but that is precisely why a hurried, one-sided Christmas deadline looks less like statesmanship and more like an ultimatum dressed up as holiday goodwill.